The jeweled Lacerta and the blue-tongued skink are both some of the best pet lizards that you could ever own, especially for a beginner. So which one's the best? Today, we're going to walk through step by step to figure out which is better for you, a jeweled Lacerta or a blue-tongued skink. My name's Adam, this is Wiccan's Wicked Reptiles. Stick around. You might be aware that this is not a blue-tongued skink or a jeweled Lacerta. Here's why I don't have one of those. I do actually have both. I own both. The jeweled Lacerta, Bob, he's outside in his enclosure. If you want to see a video about how we set that up, check it out right here. And then we've got a blue-tongued skink. I'm pretty new with blue-tongued skinks, actually owning them, but it is the first reptile I ever learned about at all. Like, this is the reptile that kind of got me into wanting to keep reptiles. They just weren't available. Irwin here is kind of new to being held. Well, I got him when he was a full-grown adult, 6 years old, and he wasn't super cool with being held by his old owner, and it's something that's a work in progress. If you hold him for more than 5 minutes, he starts hissing at you, but that's not normal, and we're going to get that into the end of the video. Blue-tongued skinks are heavy-bodied diurnal lizards from Australia, New Guinea, and Indonesia. Jeweled Lacertas are medium-bodied lizards from Western Europe. Something you're going to want to consider with anything that you get, be it a dog or a bird or a reptile, is how big does this animal actually get? With both of these, they're similar sizes, but they're different in that their overall composition of how their bodies are formed. And what I mean by this is the blue-tongued skink is kind of like a sausage with itty-bitty legs. We'll show you Irwin first, and then we'll show you Bob. You'll notice that although they're kind of the same length, they're very close to the same length, Irwin is much larger. He's much stouter, let's call it that, you know? And with him, they're going to get to a little bit bigger. They're going to get between 24 and 30 inches on average. It depends on the locale because northern, which is from Australia, and an Indonesian are completely different. The tail's longer on Indonesian. They get a little bit longer because of this. And then northerns are a little bit different of a size and composition of their structure. So it really depends on where you get them. Where jeweled Lacertas, they're all going to be basically the same sort of composition, depending if it's a male or female, of course. With skinks, you're not going to see a male and a female being too different. There are some ways to tell, but they're very similar. With jeweled Lacertas, the females are smaller, their heads are smaller, and overall, you can tell them apart just by looking at them. Bob here, and all of his kind, you're going to average right around 24 inches as the max length, females being smaller, of course. So in general, I would say the blue-tongued skink, I think I said 24 inches, 15 inches to 30 inches is what I was trying to say, depending on how they're raised, basically. But 30 inches is basically how long our boy Irwin is here. And then Bob and Lacertas, they're going to get between 15 and 24 inches. And I think if you've watched any of these videos where I do a head-to-head competition between two reptiles, you'll notice that I always pick a tie, which I'm going to do again because it depends. Do you want a bigger lizard or do you want a smaller lizard? That's what it's going to come down to, so we're going to go one apiece. The next area of concern, and this is something that you're going to want to think about, of course, also, is do you want a bigger enclosure or a smaller enclosure? And this is kind of obvious if you listen to the first part, because the blue-tongued skink is a little bit bigger. They need a little bit more room. The lights are flickering. Okay, great. Thunderstorm. Good time. Blue-tongued skinks are a little bit bigger. They're going to need a 75-gallon at very minimum or equivalent. I don't think that aquariums are necessarily the best option, but that is the equivalent that you're going to need. In my opinion, the very best option for a blue-tongued skink, full-grown for one individual, would be 24 inches in width, 48 inches in length, and then the height, depending on whatever you want to do. I mean, they only need a foot. They're not going to be climbing. They are big sausages with legs, like I mentioned before. Whereas with your jeweled Lacertas, they're going to be a little bit more nimble. They're not going to climb a bunch either. I like to have them in an 18-inch rather than a foot-tall type of enclosure. That's because you need a UVB light on them. We're going to go into that in the next section here. But a jeweled Lacerta can get away with a 55-gallon, a full-grown male. Definitely a full-grown female and juveniles for sure. Bigger is always better. There's not going to be too big of an enclosure for these guys, like within reason. But in terms of size, I think that especially if you're a beginner or you want something that doesn't take up a ton of room in your house, a jeweled Lacerta is going to be easier to care for because you don't need as much space, although they both would thrive very well in some sort of space where they have 8 square feet of floor space. So we're going to break the tie. Jeweled Lacerta gets this one, which means Jeweled Lacerta 2 and Blue Tongue Skink 1. Another obvious consideration is how you keep these animals, and heat and humidity are a big thing. We're going to throw lighting in there as well because this is kind of where it's a big difference between the two. But heat and humidity are kind of similar, actually. Just not going into super specifics. The Blue Tongue Skink, like Irwin here, you're going to want between 75 on the cool end, and then your basking spot's going to be 95. There's going to be a thermal gradient or around 95, right? So there's going to be that type of gradient. And with your Jeweled Lacerta, like Bob here, it's going to be very similar. Low 70s to mid 90s at the bask point, or the basking spot. So it's similar, right? It's not exactly the same, and the humidity is going to be a little bit different because with Jeweled Lacertas, you want it a little bit lower than an Indonesian Blue Tongue Skink, but almost exactly the same as a Northern. So right around 40 to 60%, that's where I would like to keep it. I'm not super experienced with Northerns, by the way. Indos, Indonesian Blue Tongue Skinks are kind of what I've been researching for a very long time. So I'm very confident in saying that those are going to be a higher, like 70-80% sometimes, humidity range. So it's a little bit harder to keep them, and the range is a little bit smaller in terms of temperatures that they can withstand and be happy with. So if we kept it here and didn't take into account lighting, I would probably say that Jeweled Lacertas are easier to care for. But the lighting is a big difference, and this is what I mean. With the Blue Tongue Skink, you don't really need a UVB light. I mean, it benefits them for sure, and they are basking animals, but there's no ill effects if you do not keep them with UVB. They're not going to get metabolic bone disease as long as their diet and supplementation is on point. In any of the research that I've ever done, and I mean all of the research I've ever done. Of course, personal opinions, having a UVB is probably great, right? It's not a bad thing. But with Jeweled Lacertas, they're going to get sick if you don't have a UVB. This is a big difference because UVBs, it's a second lighting system that you need, like a second lighting source. And of course, it's going to take up more room and more money, and it's something for you to consider. So because of this, I'm going to give them a tie when it comes to heat, humidity, and lighting, which I've never done before in a head-to-head competition. So it really depends. Do you want to spend the extra money on UVB lighting that you're going to have to change over and over? Or do you want to spend extra money on a misting system or extra time just manually misting? It's really up to you, and I think they kind of offset, which means we're at 3 for the Jeweled Lacerta and 1 for the Blue Tongue Skink. Alright, so you know how big the animal's going to get, you know how big the animal needs a housing space, and you know the lighting and heating parameters along with humidity. What's next? Well, diet, of course, right? Because you're going to have to feed these things if you want them to live. And this is really the fun part about having some sort of reptile, right? Is getting them to eat and watching them eat. And this is where I'm going to broaden it into the feeding and, of course, the behavior of feeding as well, because that's the fun part. With the Jeweled Lacerta, these guys are going to eat mostly insects with a little bit of vegetable and fruit matter, a bit, from the research I've done. Now, from my 3 years of keeping a Jeweled Lacerta, I know that the 2 that I've kept in my life never have eaten vegetables, and they've never eaten fruit. They will only eat insects. They've eaten pinky mice as well, but they have no interest, and I've offered them everything. Everything I've ever had with my bearded dragons that they've eaten, anything that I've ever had with my Blue Tongue Skink that he's eaten, they only eat snails and worms and crickets and things like that, pinky mice. So there is a varied diet there, but with the Blue Tongue Skink, I've never heard of anybody have an anecdote like mine. They always will eat a varied diet. And of course, without going into specifics again, you can watch the Blue Tongue Skink video right here if you like. They're going to have a mixture of plants and fruits, very little fruit, lots of vegetables, and of course, you're going to have your protein sources, which you don't even really need live feeders. I prefer live feeders, but you can get away with canned snails, or you can get away with canned worms that are dead, or you can get away with cat or dog food even. So it really depends what you want to do. And there's a lot more options, I think. With the Blue Tongue Skink, it's a little bit easier because if you wanted to, you never have to get them live feeders, although I highly recommend it. And of course, they don't need to eat as often either. In my experience, Bob, he likes to eat almost every day. I feed him usually once every 2 or 3 days. He can go a week or 2 if he really needs to, but I've never had him do this. There's no point of doing it. Where with Blue Tongue Skinks, between 1 and 2 times a week is, from the keepers that I personally know, is optimal so that they don't gain too much weight. Bob, I get a hard time getting him to gain weight. I fed him every day to get him up to where he is now, and he's still a little bit skinny. Of course, he's got metabolic bone disease. I got him that way. But Irwin, I want to make sure that he doesn't get overweight, which is something that skinks are very prone to. So you have to feed them less. It's a more varied diet. The only thing that really kind of goes in favor of the Jeweled Lacerta is they act kind of like a tegu when they eat. It's really interesting to watch them. They're very alert. They both are, but blue-tongued skinks are a little bit more lackadaisical. They like to eat at their leisure rather than chase their food around, which means that we're at 3 for the jeweled Lacerta and 2 for the blue-tongued skink. Alright, we're going to get to the fun part now. Behavior. If you want a reptile, you want it to be fun, right? Why else would you have one? And I think that most reptiles are a lot of fun, but both of these are very interesting just to watch. So if you want something that you might never even handle, but you want to watch, these guys are both great. Blue-tongued skinks are kind of derpy but interesting. You can tell that there's definitely the lights are on, somebody's home when they're looking at you and you're looking at them. And of course they have that beautiful blue tongue, which is what they get their name from, right? They're a little bit slower than a jeweled Lacerta, which, by the way, are much quicker. These guys, even Bob, who's got little T-Rex arms because he's got metabolic bone disease, he is very quick. If you want to catch him, best of luck to you. Irwin, no problem. You can get him pretty darn easy. I think that the jeweled Lacerta acts a little bit more like a tegu or like a dinosaur, if you don't know what a tegu is. They're a little bit more, I don't know, lizardy and primitive to look at and to watch in their behavior. Every time I walk by the glass, Bob is looking at me, and it's just amazing to watch him. It's so much fun. Irwin's awesome as well. This blue-tongued skink, I am so glad I got him. He is, I don't pick favorites. Yes, I do. He's my favorite in the reptile room right now, I think. But of course, with the handling, this is where they are pretty different. Jeweled Lacertas, even if they're captive bred, which most of them are in this country, Canada anyway, they're a little bit harder to tame down, and they're not as easy, in my opinion, to handle. If they bite you, you're going to know about it. They've got a really strong bite. I've been bitten through a glove, and with a bare hand as well. They don't rip skin. Like, your skin's probably not going to bleed, but it doesn't feel good. Where with the blue-tongued skink, they're a bigger lizard. I've never been bit by one, knock on wood. I don't want to be, but I feel a little bit more confident. They're a little bit slower, more predictable. And I also don't think they're going to run out of my hands as easily as a jeweled Lacerta. So I think that the ease of handling, which probably is the most fun part about having your reptile, if you want to be interactive with it, goes easily to the blue-tongued skink. And for that reason, I'm going to give this to the blue-tongued skink, which means we're knotted up at 3 apiece. Alright, we're almost done. A couple more categories. This one, I think, is maybe the most important thing to think about if you're deciding to get an animal, because price and availability, if you can't get one or you can't afford one, what's the point of even thinking about that animal? The good news is, no matter where you are, as far as I know, they're going to be able to be sourced and they're going to be able to be purchased at a reasonable price. First, availability. Both of them aren't as easy as like a leopard gecko, for example, like Sarah here, to find, but they're not hard to find either. I would say that the jeweled Lacerta is actually probably harder to find just because they're not as popular as a blue-tongued skink, where blue-tongued skinks, especially in the last 5 years especially, are really popular. But it evens out because although there's more breeding effort going with the Indonesian and northern varieties of blue-tongued skink, they produce smaller litters. They give live birth. It's harder to breed them, where jeweled Lacertas will give bigger clutches of eggs, and it's easier to breed them. I think that that's what kind of evens it out. I think both are amazing, and jeweled Lacertas are way underrated. This is the most amazing lizard, small lizard in a small space, that you could watch, in my opinion, in terms of interest. But with price, there is kind of a big difference. Jeweled Lacertas, in my neck of the woods, you can get them for about 150 bucks pretty easily. I've seen them as low as 75 bucks, and that's what I hear from my American friends, that 75, 80 to 100 is right about right for a jeweled Lacerta, a baby captive bred. Whereas with an Indonesian blue-tongued skink, they're likely, they might be wild caught. That's definitely a possibility. Northerns will 100% be captive bred. They're going to be more expensive though. Here, where I live, Northerns, if you want a baby, 500 bucks is a steal. That is a deal. In Indonesian, even 350 is a deal. I got a wicked deal on Irwin. That's why I got him when I got him. I literally saw him and got him the same day when I saw him on the classified ad. But I think it's important to mention, always research your animal, and I put 20 years of research into blue-tongued skinks before I actually got one. But I'm glad I got him. So I think this one's going to be a wash between the two, right? Because blue-tongued skinks are easier to find, or as easy to find. There's probably more people that have them anyway, or are breeding them. Just smaller litter sizes, and they're more sought after. So it's kind of a first come, first serve, and there's a lot of people coming first to come get them. But they're going to be more expensive, where a jeweled Lacerta is going to be cheaper for you, but it's going to be a little bit harder to find because there's not as much breeding effort being put forth So I'm going to give this one a tie as well, which means we're knotted up at 4 apiece. Alright, let's break the tie. The last category is morphs. Now, you might not be super eager to get a morph of either one of these because you're new to reptiles or you just want one because you don't have one yet. But there's a clear winner here. And when it comes to blue-tongued skink, there's tons. There's tons and tons of morphs that you can get. They're really hard to find in some places, especially up here in Canada. Like, they're really hard to find. But jeweled Lacertas, no matter where you are, I mean, there's amelanistic animals, but there's really not a lot going on in terms of getting yourself a morph of a jeweled Lacerta. You're going to probably get a normal or something that looks very close to a normal, where with blue-tongued skinks, there's tons of different ones. If you want a darker one, do you want one that's almost red? Do you want one that's lighter? It really is up to you. There's way more variety, and because of this, that's going to break the tie. It's just there's more out there in terms of blue-tongued skinks, and there's more localities, so if you want something with stockier body, shorter tail, something with a longer tail, it really depends, right? But there's more options for blue-tongued skinks, which means 5-4, blue-tongued skinks win, in my biased opinion, by the way, because I've had jeweled Lacertas longer, but I don't know. Irwin, there's something special about blue-tongued skinks for me. Of course, this doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It's just I'm presenting the facts, and this is what my opinion more than anything else. But that's the point of the video. You get someone who's had both animals and who's someone who's experienced with reptiles to tell you about each one, and then you can make a decision for yourself. So there is no right answer, but I appreciate you coming along and watching this episode of Wiccan's Wicked Reptiles. What should I put in my next head-to-head video? If you want to stick around to the end, there's going to be a few videos for you to choose from. But otherwise, because I do videos twice a week, that means that I'll see you on Monday.